So this week in our study of Paul and the first Christians, we are going to be finishing up our look at his letter to the Galatians. In this week, we're going to be looking at the last two chapters, 5 and 6. And so to begin with this, I'll kind of provide a summary, and then we're going to hone in on one particular text that we'll look at, and I've got some study questions that we've been using over the last couple of weeks that if you look in this Facebook page, there'll be a link to pull those that handout that has the study questions if you haven't already done that yet. So that's kind of the rhythm of what we'll be going through. And also in this Facebook page, you'll see a link to the document that kind of gives an intro to Galatians, or at least an intro by way of what are the main themes in this particular letter. So to begin with, these last two chapters of Galatians, what are some of the main things? What's kind of some of the summary points that we want to pull out from these last two chapters? If there's one word that's going to describe these two things that is going to keep coming up and up and up, is the word freedom. And so if we look at the first four chapters of this letter, Paul's really been building his theological case for why Gentile Christians do not have to observe Torah and go and enter into those boundary marker things such as circumcision and dietary laws and keeping the calendar and holy days. So he's been building the theological case, and now we get to chapter 5 and we take this turn now to, okay, what does this mean in everyday life? We might think that this is even the ethical place for Paul, where he is talking about the ethics of what you ought to be doing. So you're given this freedom in Christ, so now how do we end up living? So some of the main things come up. Again, this idea of circumcision comes up again. And for Paul, circumcision is neither bad nor good. What he's really fighting against are the people who are saying that the circumcision is required in order to be a disciple of Christ and to become a part of the covenant community. So he's not saying getting circumcised is bad, but it's the laying on of the requirement to Gentile Christians that they must now partake of these same boundary markers before they are considered in. So anyway, circumcision is irrelevant in Christ. And so if for the Gentile Christians specifically, if they were to seek out to be circumcised, the male disciples, then it really begins to invalidate what Christ did and the life that we have in Christ. Another point going through this is freedom. So Paul is preaching this gospel of freedom, but then the downside to this freedom is, okay, well, if I've got all the freedom, then that becomes an excuse for me to do whatever I want to in terms of immorality and being irresponsible and just living for my own self, right? That's kind of the downside to this freedom, and that's probably a lot of the criticism that Paul actually took. And so he counters that in this section, and then he moves on to this idea that freedom is this communal reality. In America, we tend to think that freedom means my own personal freedoms. You can't take my personal freedoms away. Like, that is the centerpiece of an American ideology, is your own personal freedoms. For Paul, personal freedom really doesn't make sense to him. This freedom is a communal freedom, that we only experience this freedom as it is in relation to others. And there's also this really interesting paradox that he mentions in here, that it's only in our use of freedom that we act, it's in our use of freedom that we become, he uses the word slaves, that we become slaves to others out of love. And so there's this paradox of freedom, but also being responsible to to others. Freedom is a communal reality. Other things that we would want to mention is that what matters in Christ is the Christ-like life of faith expressing itself in love. So the teachers that he's fighting against are those that are saying, here's our boundary markers to set up who is in and who is out. And so Gentiles were immediately on the outside, and so they're saying you have to come inside our boundary markers. For Paul, he's saying those boundary markers mean nothing. The only thing in Christ means expressing yourself in love. That is what the true freedom is, and that's what ultimately fulfills Torah, which is loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. So life in Christ becomes one not of setting up what these boundary markers are, but of walking in the Spirit, of staying in step with the Spirit. And I've used this word before, this cruciform, that you take on this form of the cross where you die to yourself in order that the fruit of the Spirit might be produced. And it's in these passages that we have this very common, popular passage about the fruit of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That's what walking in Christ looks like, staying in step with the Spirit. And those who stay in step with the Spirit, those who walk in spirit, then mean that we are a part of this covenant community where we are in relationship with God and in relationship with others. And that becomes the fulfillment of the law. And Paul uses this word of the law of Christ. Right? It's this pattern of life that we live into. That's what matters now. So we're going to dig into the first several verses for this week in chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. So I'll go ahead and read that for us. Verse 1. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Listen, I, Paul, am telling you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no benefit to you. So once again, I testify to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obliged to obey the entire law. You who want to be justified by the law have cut yourselves off from Christ. You have fallen away from grace, for through the Spirit, by faith, we eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. And here's kind of this key sentence, this thesis statement almost, if you will. This is the main point of what Paul is getting at in his entire letter. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. The only thing that counts is faith working through love. You were running well. Who prevented you from obeying the truth? Such persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. A little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough. So I am confident that you in the Lord, that you will not think otherwise. But whoever it is that is confusing you will pay the penalty. But, my friends, why am I still being persecuted if I'm still preaching circumcision? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. I wish those who unsettle you would castrate themselves. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. So here's the questions I want you to consider. Again, look at the Facebook post for the link to the study guide. And then while you're using this, maybe have that handout of the main themes of Galatians, that intro to Galatians with you handy. That might help you out in this. So as we look through this specific section of Galatians 5 verses 1 through 15, here's the questions. What are the key words or phrases in this passage, and what do these mean? So kind of some of these key words that I'm hearing are like freedom and slavery, and how are those things held in tension? Paul really loves to do this, to play these different words in tension with each other. Words like faith and words like circumcision and love, words like the law. So dig into these things. What do these mean? Not necessarily how we might define them, but look at how Paul defines them in the letter of Galatians and what we've been talking about over the course of this study together. Then you're going to want to look at what are the overall themes of this passage. How does it fit into the bigger picture of this letter? I think we're already, even with those key words, you're already hitting on some very big themes that Paul wants to talk about as far as circumcision and our life of living in the way of Christ, which is the way of love. So then these next two questions then get us to kind of embody this text, asking ourselves to put ourselves in the shoes of those who first received this letter. If you were a new Gentile Christian that was not a Jewish believer, how are you hearing these words now? And then bring this into our own context, putting yourselves back into your own shoes. What does this passage mean to you right now? And then finally, as we look at how Paul kind of moves throughout Galatians, we don't necessarily see it in this passage that we're looking at, but just a little bit beyond, he really starts talking about the life in the Spirit. And so we want to ask this question: where is the Spirit leading you? How is the Spirit speaking through the words of Paul coming into your life, and where is that now leading you possibly into what we might think of like the fruits of the Spirit? So those are our questions for you to dig into. So this video has been a springboard to help you get into Galatians 5, 1 through 15, and even the bigger context of chapters 5 and 6. And so this is going to conclude our section on Galatians. So then next week we're going to jump into the book of Philippians. But again, if you've got any questions or comments, put them into the Facebook post here, or you can certainly contact me directly if you've got any questions. So grace and peace to you.